All right, so today, talking about Sonny's Blues. Like I said, this is one of my favorite things we've read this semester. It's a really complex narrative, really beautifully written, really human story. And it deals with some difficult things, right? We have um, oppression and systemic racism against black community here. That's like kind of underlying everything. We have drug addiction. We have drug addiction's connection to music. Really interesting things going on with music in this story. So I'll just say this, but we can't dwell on the sad things. But this is one of those stories I really wish we could talk about in person because I think it would just be better served. The story would be better served if we could have a conversation about this and kind of the complexities here. But I'll do my best to offer you some entry points into this story and to talk a little bit about James Baldwin. Okay? Just to give a little bit of background on who Baldwin is, so he was born and raised in Harlem. So he was born in 1924. So he was born in the Harlem Renaissance, but he didn't grow up at that time, right? His coming of age was kind of in the aftermath of the Harlem Renaissance. Um, and so he's not in the same generation as like Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston. So he's maybe a second generation um, or a generation after of those black artists. So he's going to look at things in a different way. Um, so religion is also really important to his upbringing. His father was a Baptist minister, and Baldwin actually became a preacher in the Pentecostal tradition when he was 14. He was drawing really large crowds, kind of entered this life with fervor. But eventually he decided to leave the church. He left the church at 17. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but as we talk about Sonny's Blues. But the church was certainly an important influence for him. Whether he wasn't a part of the church, he saw it as a important force in the black experience. So we could talk about that. The Fire Next Time, um, this really good book, nonfiction book that he wrote. He talks about religion and kind of the problems he has with it, but also how it plays an important role for the black community. So I would recommend that text if you haven't read it. So he moved to Paris when he was 24. We'll see this because I have a clip of Baldwin later, but he talks about kind of why he moved to Paris. He felt like in Europe he wasn't just defined by his race in the same way that he was in the United States. Also, Baldwin was gay, and he lived as an out man in a time that it really wasn't accepted in the United States, so he found more freedom in Europe and Paris. So he lived most of his adult life in Europe. So I just want to talk a little bit about Baldwin's perspective. I love this picture of him, a young James Baldwin here. So although he left the US, he was an expatriate. He constantly wrote about and commented on life in the US. It's almost as if the distance gave him a clearer view or a clearer picture of what was happening in his home country. And he also traveled back to the US often, and he was a major figure in the civil rights movement. We don't hear a lot about, so of course people like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, he knew these people, he was in communication with these people quite a bit. But there was a lot of black artists, people like Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin, who are working towards civil rights, who we don't hear as much about. And I think because Baldwin was such a kind of cultural critic, he kind of gets left out of some of these conversations because it's more complex. He's a very complex figure. Um, and like I was talking about before, he had this complex relationship with religion, and he saw this as both a liberating and constraining force in his own life, but also in the life of the black community. So we can definitely see that in Sonny's Blues, I think. To talk a little bit about Baldwin's writing and who he was as a writer and kind of his persona as a writer. So he's best known for nonfiction and fiction. So essays is like he wrote a lot of essays. So that's his nonfiction. Very also personal essays, so kind of memoirish type writing. And then fiction, he wrote a number of novels. But he also wrote poetry. He wrote plays. He wrote music. So he really was a prolific writer. Actually, I would say he's one of the best writers. He's one of the best U.S. like writers that has existed in the U.S. Okay, that's my like major statement. And if you want to disagree, let me know. Okay, so I see though in his fiction and in his nonfiction essays, kind of almost two different methods or two different coming at issues or the themes that he explores, and which is a lot of the themes he explores is about the Black experience in the United States. But he seems to come at them in two different directions with his nonfiction and essays and with his fiction. In his nonfiction, he's a really direct voice. So he directly confronts the experience of the African American person. So he offers searing depictions of institutional racism. He's trying to call out kind of how racism is built into the institutions of the United States. And I think he does so brilliantly in these essays. Again, Notes of a Native Son is one of his major texts of essays. That's a really amazing book. The Fire Next Time. If you read Between the World and Me, which is by Ta-Nehisi Coates, that was modeled on The Fire Next Time. So he's kind of angry in the nonfiction, really, like I said, direct and confronting voice. In his fiction, however, I think he's going at it about it in a different way. Like, there's nothing wrong with this nonfiction. I think at that time it was really important to have that kind of voice working. But in his fiction, he really engages with fundamental personal questions and dilemmas in the midst of complex social and psychological pressures in the context of the US and Europe. So he's really digging into the identities, to the personal questions and dilemmas of his specific characters in the midst of a lot of different pressures. So he writes often about the Black experience, but he also writes about white characters. He looks at these issues from different perspectives. So it's kind of like how can you be a person? How should you be a person when it feels like the system is against you? So he's writing these very like human stories and looking at kind of individual lives and trying to enter those characters' lives to explore these issues in a way that he doesn't in his essays, which are much more direct in terms of confronting the issues of racism. Okay. But I would recommend anything that he's written. So what I want to do now is just give you a taste of Baldwin as social and cultural critic. So this is a video of Baldwin on the Dick Cavett show. So this was a late night show. So I just want you to imagine this being on Jimmy Fallon or Jimmy Kimmel. And it's hard to imagine that it would ever be something like this. But Dick Cavett was kind of known for having these types of discussions on his television shows. So I see Baldwin in his very like nonfiction social critic direct voice against racism mode. I think it's worth a watch, so we can just watch it together.
I would like to add someone to our group here. Professor Paul Weiss, a Sterling Professor of Philosophy at Yale. Were you able to listen to the show backstage?
I heard a good deal of it, but then I was behind the rostrum here.
Yes.
So I heard only some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with?
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And, of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. He has all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability, and the problem is to become a man.
But what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by the society when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who is against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu. I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than it already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You have to be able then to turn up all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians, and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
That's really amazing, right? So here he is kind of explaining in very clear terms, using this evidence that he sees, something like systemic racism, right? The racism that is built into institutions. He's also showing that here, this Yale philosopher comes on and says, like, we shouldn't just be thinking about race, like there's other ways to find connection. And I don't think Baldwin would disagree with him, but what he's saying is for the black community, right, that first and foremost, there's this issue and there's this possibility of them actually dying, of them losing their lives, right, because of this institutional racism. So if you can't stop thinking about that, then how can you find these other connections? Anyway, this is Baldwin as social critic, very direct, very clear, laying out his points. I think not combative. He does it in a very calm way, but I think in a very direct way. So this is Baldwin definitely in his social critic mode. So obviously, that's quite a bit different from Sonny's Blues, which to me is this very human story, this kind of painful story about connection and seeking connection, and these two black men who are trying to find connection between each other, between brothers, and also searching for a way to deal with that kind of darkness or the institutional racism that Baldwin was discussing. This is a classic James Baldwin story. This is him at the height of his powers. This is a really, really amazing story. So just some things that some entry points to this story, some things I want us to think about. First of all, thinking about Harlem as an environment. How does it exist as this physical space, but also what's going on metaphysically in terms of what's happening in how does Baldwin kind of see it? Oh, I'll talk about this in a second. Sorry. So Harlem as environment, so kind of the blacks' experience in the city, in New York City, and also coming of age. What does it mean to grow up in Harlem? So other major themes: music, addiction, religion. How those things kind of intertwine in an interesting way in this story, and then questions around family bonds. Okay, so let's think about Harlem as this environment. Okay, so this is what I was trying to talk about, right, before. So Baldwin describes this place in physical terms, but he also describes it in metaphysical, or what I would call spiritual terms, right? There's something happening in the air that's not just about like the physical experience of the place. He uses this term, the darkness. I want you to think about, what is this darkness? What is kind of lurking around these streets and these places, and how do they have to navigate it? I think you can think about the way the narrator looks at his students, right? He's a teacher in Harlem. He's looking at his students. He's thinking about their experience in this kind of darkness of Harlem. He's thinking about his experience, Sonny's experience, the way they move and have to kind of exist in this place. It's really interesting to think about. Another major question here is the possibility of escape and thinking about Harlem as a trap. It's really interesting to think about Harlem as a trap here. So for your discussion, or for your response post this week, or for this assignment, I'm asking you to do some close reading. So for the PowerPoint, I'm bringing in some passages just to show, like, here are some important passages. This is some things that I want you to think about. So in this passage, we kind of see Harlem as a trap here. He uses this metaphor of a trap. So he says, but houses exactly the houses of our past yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys we once had been found themselves smothering in these houses. Came down into the streets for light and air and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. Those who got out always left something behind, as some animals amputate a leg and leave it in a trap. So I want you to think about this metaphor, right? What is this choice in this passage doing? How is it expressing meaning? How is it creating this sense or this feeling of what Harlem is for these characters? And the passage continues. So we hit 110th Street, started rolling up Lenox Avenue, and I'd known this avenue all my life, but it seemed to me again, as it had seemed on the day I'd first heard about Sonny's trouble, filled with a hidden menace, which was its very breath of life. Right? So think about these choices. Think about the word choices. Something like hidden menace is really interesting. And then saying its very breath of life. What does that suggest about Harlem, the environment of Harlem? What it means to be there? What does it mean for it to be hidden? There's a lot going on in each of these passages. Another important passage, this is where he kind of really examines this idea of darkness. So he's talking about them on a Sunday afternoon. They come into the living room after church and they spend time together. Kind of the lights pour through the windows, and people can forget the darkness. But when they have to turn the lights on inside, they realize that there's this darkness outside. So it's not just physical darkness, but something else. I love this last sentence. I mean, it's really powerful. It's difficult but powerful. The child knows what they won't talk about anymore. The child knows that they won't talk about it anymore. I think I left out in it. Because if he knows too much about what happened to them, he'll know too much too soon about what's going to happen to him. So even these italics here, right? These are italics that Baldwin purposely puts into the text. There's something happening with the choices in this passage. The child knows that they won't talk anymore. All right, so actually I didn't leave out a bit. The child knows that they won't talk anymore because if he knows too much about what happened to them, he'll know too much too soon about what's going to happen to him. So what is this darkness? What is this thing that they're kind of afraid of, or they don't want to talk about, or don't want to share with their children? There's a really interesting kind of inside and outside thing going on also in this passage. There's something inside, there's something outside. What does that suggest about the experience of a black person in Harlem? Okay, so of course, music is, as the title suggests, one of the major kind of motifs, one of the major ideas going through this whole story. Music plays a central role in the narrative, but it has a complex, layered meaning in the story and to the characters, right? Music doesn't just mean one thing to the narrator, to Sonny, to, I think, the reader, to Baldwin, right? Music is so big, it kind of can hold a lot of different things for this story. So what I want you to think about, specifically, what does jazz music represent for Sonny versus what it represents for the narrator? For Sonny, it might mean escape, freedom. And I have this other question: is there freedom in music? Question mark. For the narrator, it's like he also sees it as kind of an escape, but this scary escape, this relinquishing of responsibility. He sees it as, what does he call it? Like it's something for good time people, right? So people who don't really take things seriously or life seriously. I think there's also something going on, and Baldwin explores this in a really subtle, interesting way, and he doesn't really give us a lot of answers around this, but he explores the relationship between music and drugs. I think there's this like long-term idea that artists and specifically musicians have to be have to somehow be messed up. And Sonny talks about this, right? That some people really believe this, that you have to have some kind of drug experience to create good art, or whatever that is. I'm, of course, not endorsing this, but I think it's something that Baldwin really explores and thinks about. Why do these things work together, or why do people see these together? What is music offering that drugs might, but what does music offer that drugs don't, right? It seems like they're both attempts at escape, while music might offer a freedom or even momentary freedom. Drugs are just going to drown you further and further. I think he uses the idea of drowning a few times. So to drown in music is a kind of a freedom, but to drown in drugs is another kind of enslavement, I think this story might argue. But there's also thinking about too pain and suffering and how music relates to that. So to give some historical background here, I wanted to think about that conversation between Sonny and the narrator, his brother, his older brother. I think older is important too. So I love these couple lines. So the narrator asks, "You mean like Louis Armstrong?" When Sonny says he wants to play jazz music, he's like, "You mean like Louis Armstrong?" Like he's trying, right? He's trying to make a connection. He's like, "No." Sonny says, "I'm not talking about none of that old time down home crap." And when he's like, "Well, who are you talking about?" He says, "Bird." And he's like, "Who's Bird?" He says, "Bird, Charlie Parker. Don't they teach you nothing in that goddamn army?" Okay, so I love this scene because it really shows how jazz music or music can become this cultural signifier. I think if you talk to friends and you say, "Oh, I love Miley Cyrus," that's going to suggest something. That's going to say something to other people. The same is here. So to say like, I love Louis Armstrong. Oh, I love jazz music. I love Louis Armstrong. There was this sense as jazz became kind of a more popular form of music, people started to break off from the mainstream and kind of create new forms of jazz. And so Louis Armstrong came to represent the kind of like old-timey almost like white man's jazz, whereas somebody like Bird or Charlie Parker represented something new, something exciting. So he was a part of a group who was developing a kind of jazz music called bebop. So bebop was experimental, it was innovative, it was a little bit. And let me play these videos, just a little bit of each video, so you can see the difference or hear the difference. So here's Louis Armstrong. It has a nice, swinging pace. And it kind of feels nice. It's enjoyable. But compare this to Charlie Parker here. Okay, so compared to Louis Armstrong, right? It's a lot faster, a lot more frenetic, less even, much more syncopated and dynamic, less on the beat here. Jury's out on that if they're actually playing in this video, but you get the sense, right? The music is a lot different than what Louis Armstrong was playing. So, when Sonny talks about kind of the difference between Louis Armstrong and Charlie Parker, there's this clear kind of generational divide, but also when Charlie Parker represented a type of jazz music that was more experimental, was more exciting, was a little bit more dangerous, was a little bit more outside of the mainstream. And not for nothing, I think it's really important that Charlie Parker died of I can't remember if he died of a drug overdose. I think he did. So he had problems with drugs. So I think the idea that Sonny's idol is someone who has a heroin addiction, that signifies something. I'm looking up really quick if Charlie Parker died of so basically what I'm trying to say here, yeah, he had a long-going heroin addiction. It was really prevalent in the jazz scene. There was something about okay, so he didn't die of an overdose, but he was addicted to heroin. Okay, so there was this kind of connection that maybe young players like a Sonny would have seen in between drugs and music, and maybe seen like this is a way to find escape, or this is a way to develop into the jazz scene, whatever that is. But to use Charlie Parker in this way, Baldwin was really purposely trying to make a point. Okay? This passage here is kind of talking about how the narrator understands music and like how does that connect to Sonny. I love this idea, like, I didn't like the way he carried himself, loose and dreamlike all the time, and I didn't like his friends, and his music seemed to be merely an excuse for the life he led. It sounded just that weird and disordered. So this idea of how the music, how he's kind of living the music to his brother. The brother sees him living in a way that expresses the kind of disordered, the frenetic energy that is in the bebop jazz music. Okay, so here's several passages. I'm not going to read them out loud. I think the first one is about the people who are doing the religious revival on the street, and the women who are really expressing their pain through music. And Sonny makes that connection between music and drugs. I think it's pretty harrowing pretty harrowing passage, and it says something about this idea, this search for ecstasy through religion. Meaning, what I mean by ecstasy is the search of kind of enlightenment or kind of a joyous experience. And Sonny makes that connection between the religious and musical experience and drugs, and that's a really interesting point. Again, I don't think Baldwin's endorsing drugs. I think he's showing and he's trying to understand why would people like Sonny turn to drugs. So again, here, this next passage, I think, is again this kind of question: is why would someone turn to drugs? No, there's no way not to suffer, but you try all kinds of ways to keep from drowning in it, to keep on top of it, and to make it seem, well, like you did something, all right, and now you're suffering for it, you know? And later he talks about not being able to escape the storm inside and trying to listen to other people, right? So there's all this kind of swirling around. It's really complex, really subtle. Baldwin's exploring and trying to get at why would a character like Sonny can turn to music? Why would he turn to jazz music? Why would he turn to this particular kind of jazz music? How would that then get him in a place where he's using drugs? How would that get him into a place where he's using drugs enough that he goes to jail for it? But I don't think he's condemning him either. I think what he's trying to do is really trying to understand. He's trying to grasp what could possibly be going on in someone's life that they could turn to this, and what kind of escape are they searching for? Again, underlying all of this is that darkness, right? That systemic institutional racism that they're dealing with in Harlem. I think too, in music, in that final scene, that amazing final scene when the brother comes and watches Sonny play, he has this experience and finds freedom through music. As he's listening to Sonny, and it repeats this idea of listening, and if you listen closely enough, you can find connection. He sees kind of all of the suffering in his life. He feels all the suffering, but he also finds freedom in that, right? Music allows this kind of redemption for him. Okay, I moved through that pretty fast. And family bonds, some questions here. I want you to think about, what do families owe each other? How can we take care of each other? What does it mean to take care of each other as family? And alternative family bonds. Think about the final scene when they're all playing together and the narrator sees them becoming a family again, right? Sonny, this passage here, Sonny was part of the family again. So this musical family, how he finds kind of an alternative family dynamic with these other musicians. And then also this other passage is Sonny and the narrator's mother telling the narrator, you have to take care of your brother. He's your family. There's darkness out there. The world has not changed. You need to take care of him. No matter what happens, you need to take care of him. So what responsibility do we have to each other? Okay, that's really fast. It's way too fast for this amazing story. Please send me your thoughts on this. I'd love to hear what you think. Again, I think this is a very human story that's trying to get at a lot of different things, trying to understand dynamics between two brothers. I love that it's a first-person narrative of an unnamed narrator trying to kind of explore or see what's going on with his brother. How can I help my brother? How can I take care of him? It's also a story that's really trying to understand how Sonny got to the place that he's got. How did Sonny get to a place of drug addiction? And I think it's a beautiful kind of humane exploration of what it means to live in the darkness of racism. And I think nobody does that better than Baldwin.